Okie doke. So the very last of our respiratory processes looks at the transport of these respiratory gases. How do these respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, move through the body? Of course, it's through the blood, but how does it travel through the blood? We're going to look at oxygen transport first, and then carbon dioxide transport. So you'll see that most of the oxygen, as you might have guessed from when we learned about hemoglobin back in the other chapter, almost all of the oxygen that gets moved by our body is bound to the iron in the hemoglobin. So 4 oxygen per hemoglobin, thousands and thousands of hemoglobin per red blood cell. So really we're mostly traveling in the hemoglobin. A tiny little bit, about 1.5%, actually dissolves in the plasma, but primarily we're talking about hemoglobin again. Hemoglobin's got a really cool shape, and in fact, as oxygen binds to hemoglobin, as one molecule of oxygen binds to hemoglobin, hemoglobin almost kind of changes shape a little and actually attracts even more oxygen. So the affinity for oxygen to hemoglobin increases. It's attracted even more as oxygen gets released, as one molecule of oxygen leaves hemoglobin, hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen decreases. This basically makes it easier both to pick up or load oxygen onto the hemoglobin and then release or unload the oxygen at all of the tissues that need it. So again, hemoglobin is a neat little protein. It's this whole idea, again, of form fits functionality. In terms of kind of saturation, remember that hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen maximum. That's what we would then call a fully saturated hemoglobin molecule. If it doesn't have all 4 heme groups carrying oxygen, then it's what we call partially saturated. And even the blood that we think of as deoxygenated blood almost really never has no oxygen bound to it. It usually is at least partially saturated with one hemoglobin or one heme attached to the oxygen. So right, here's our deoxyhemoglobin. When we pick up oxygen in our lungs, we get oxyhemoglobin, and then when we drop it off at the tissues, we're back to deoxyhemoglobin. Again, it's never quite fully saturated, or fully unsaturated, as it were, but we'll still think of it as deoxygenated and oxygenated. It's just easier. In terms of what kind of affects how oxygen and hemoglobin kind of associate with one another, how they bind to one another. We're going to look at 4 things. We're going to first actually look at the partial pressure of oxygen. We're then going to look at temperature, the pH of the blood, and then also the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. But the primary driving force that influences how oxygen and hemoglobin bind is the partial pressure of oxygen. And so we have this thing called the oxygen-hemoglobin disassociation curve. And it's this idea that when we plot the partial pressure of oxygen and against the percentage of oxygen that's bound to a hemoglobin, so how percent saturation of our hemoglobin, we don't get a straight line, we don't get a flat line. What we get is this very S-shaped curve. What this really means for us is that in our tissues where the partial pressure is lower, hemoglobin is less saturated. There are still lots of hemoglobin molecules that have oxygen bound to them, but much less so than in areas where we have a high partial pressure of oxygen, like in the lungs. And there you can see our hemoglobin is fully saturated. The reason this S shape in the curve is important is because even if the partial pressure of oxygen changes, we still have so much oxygen stored on our hemoglobin that it kind of doesn't really affect us. So the best way to think of this is to look at a sea level versus a high altitude example. You can see, because now we're talking about, we can look at how partial pressure changes kind of just atmospherically. So here at sea level, very, 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 low pressure and a really, really, really high partial pressure of oxygen. There's plenty of oxygen around here at sea level. And you can see our hemoglobin molecules in our blood are 98% saturated. But if we go up the Rocky Mountains at a high altitude, there's less oxygen available. The air is harder to breathe. But because of hemoglobin's very wonderful affinity for oxygen, if you look at the saturation of your oxygen, you're still almost fully saturated. And so even if we go to higher altitudes, our hemoglobin molecule works so well that we still don't really lose a lot of our kind of affinity, our magnetism for hemoglobin and oxygen. We're still pretty fully saturated in terms of the amount of oxygen our hemoglobin molecules are carrying around our body. And that's really helpful. So even if you have a person who has lung disease, so that they're not getting enough oxygen or they're getting less oxygen in, their body is still pretty good in terms of getting the oxygen it requires. If you look at how temperature, pH, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide affect how hemoglobin and oxygen bind to each other, we'll see that anytime we increase the body's temperature, which means we are having an active tissue, that also increases the acidity because our active tissues make lots of hydrogen and also produce lots of carbon dioxide. All of these things indicate a high body temperature, a high pH level in our blood, and a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide indicate an active tissue. And the cool thing about that is when these factors go up, indicating an active tissue, that actually decreases the attraction that hemoglobin has for oxygen. And so it makes oxygen coming off of the hemoglobin, oxygen onloading, much easier, which is great because if we're having an active tissue, we want to give it oxygen more easily. Conversely, if you decrease the body's temperature, if you decrease the amount of acidity, so increase the pH and decrease the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which generally indicates an inactive tissue, then hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen goes up. And so if you have a tissue that's not as active, it doesn't need as much oxygen. And so that discourages oxygen onloading. So it's really kind of cool, I think, that our body is so just amazingly well adjusted to getting oxygen to the areas that need it most. This idea that the active tissues get the most oxygen is called the Bohr effect. As we make and use glucose, as we use up the oxygen, as we go through aerobic respiration, we increase the amount of carbon dioxide, which increases our partial pressure of carbon dioxide. We increase the amount of hydrogen produced, which decreases our pH, and that kind of weakens that hemoglobin bond with the oxygen. So we get our most active tissues getting the oxygen the most, and it comes off very easily. Again, heat production, that's an active tissue thing. And so directly decreases the amount of oxygen we get to our active tissues. Just by the very act that they are needing it means that they can then get it, which is kind of cool. In terms of imbalances, typically what we talk about is hypoxia. This is inadequate oxygen delivery. We're not getting enough oxygen delivery. And if we don't get enough oxygen to our tissues, we end up with something called cyanosis. It's like when your lips turn blue. And we break all of our hypoxias into kind of their cause. So anemic hypoxia is because you have too few red blood cells. Maybe you're not producing enough erythropoietin. Maybe you have a sickle cell disease or something like that, and so not enough hemoglobin, abnormal hemoglobin, that's an anemic hypoxia. Ischemic hypoxia results from a blocked blood vessel. So say you had arterial sclerosis or something in one of your arteries. If that tissue served by the artery didn't get enough oxygen, that would be a type of ischemic hypoxia. Oh, excuse me. Hypoxemic hypoxia is usually due to a pulmonary disease. So you're not getting enough oxygen because you've got something wrong with your ventilation system. And then the other way that we get hypoxia is through carbon monoxide poisoning. That's why they're always, if you watch the commercials, they're always telling you to put carbon monoxide detectors in. And that's usually what kills us very often when we get trapped in fires. Unfortunately for us, carbon monoxide has a much greater affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen does. And so essentially what happens essentially in carbon monoxide poisoning is the oxygens get kind of kicked off the hemoglobin molecules and the carbon monoxide bonds instead. And carbon monoxide is not oxygen, it doesn't work for us. Okay, next step here, or not last step, but next step is carbon dioxide transport. And carbon dioxide has a little bit more diversity in how it gets moved through the blood. About 7 to 10% is actually dissolved in the plasma. About 20% of it is actually bound not to the heme part of the hemoglobin, but to the globin part of the hemoglobin, in which case we get carbaminohemoglobin as a result. But most of it, 70% of it, is transported as bicarbonate ions in our plasma. So we have to look at the equation that results in bicarbonate ions. So CO2 is a byproduct of our aerobic respiration. Our plasma is, our bodies are a lot of water. So when carbon dioxide and water combine, they become carbonic acid. Well, carbonic acid disassociates very easily into hydrogen ions, which are acidic, and bicarbonate ions, which are basic. There are kind of two places and two speeds at which this reaction occurs. It can occur directly in the plasma. It's a little bit slower because there's no enzyme for this reaction to take place. But in our red blood cells, they have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which basically catalyzes this reaction so that it occurs more quickly. So turning CO2 into bicarbonate, both of these will occur, both the slow reaction and the fast reaction. The slow reaction occurs directly in the plasma. That's the only step. The fast reaction with the enzyme has a couple of little steps to it. And we'll look at that in just a second. But when carbon dioxide is created in our red blood cells with this carbonic anhydrase enzyme, very quickly it diffuses out of the red blood cells and into the plasma, where it then actually travels through the body. But we kind of have to keep our charges balanced, and so as we get this kind of outflux of bicarbonate from the red blood cells, chlorine, another negatively charged anion, moves into the red blood cells, which keeps the red blood cell charges kind of neutral. We refer to that as the chloride shift. So just look at hopefully this will make more sense once I show you the little diagram here. So let's look at, well, we can look at oxygen first. You can see a little bit dissolves in the plasma and then unloads here into the tissues. But most of it is bound up into hemoglobin. The hemoglobin will disassociate from the oxygen, and the oxygen will diffuse through the plasma and then to the tissues. But then let's look at the CO2. So here's all the CO2 that an active tissue made, and some of it just directly dissolves in the plasma. Some of it combines with the water in the plasma, and then through the slow reaction becomes carbonic acid, and then disassociates to bicarbonate and protein ions, which then usually bind to some plasma proteins so we don't screw up our blood pH. Some hemoglobin, about 20%, binds onto the globin part of the hemoglobin. We get carbaminohemoglobin, but most of it, 70% of it, good chunk of it anyway, diffuses into the plasma with the help of the carbonic anhydrase enzyme, is very rapidly converted into carbonic acid, which then breaks down into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And then those bicarbonate ions very quickly diffuse out into the plasma, where the bicarbonate ions are then transported through the blood. To balance out this outrush of negative charge in the bicarbonate, chlorine kind of gets imported, which keeps our red blood cells balanced in terms of charge. And that's our chloride shift. So that's at our systemic tissues. That's the release of oxygen and the pickup of carbon dioxide at all of our body's tissues. In the lungs, in the pulmonary capillaries, the process is basically reversed. Now we're picking up oxygen and unloading carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide will move back into the red blood cells. That means the chlorine is going to move out of the red blood cell back into the plasma. The bicarbonate combines with hydrogen ions. We get carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is split by, again, this carbonic anhydrase enzyme into water and CO2, and the CO2 diffuses into the alveoli. Again, I'm going to show you a figure, and hopefully that'll help it make more sense. Let's look at oxygen first. So here's our oxygen inside our alveolus. You can see some of it will dissolve directly in the plasma, but most of it comes into the plasma, binds onto the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. If we look at carbon dioxide, some of it has been traveling through the blood, dissolved directly in the plasma, so it just then diffuses directly out of the plasma and into the alveolus. Some of it was converted into some of the bicarbonate will become carbonic acid, but without the enzyme, it is then kind of slowly reverts to carbon dioxide and water, but then the carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the plasma and into the alveolus. Some of the carbon dioxide is bound on as carbaminohemoglobin. It disassociates from the hemoglobin and diffuses out of the red blood cell through the plasma and into the alveolus. But most of the bicarbonate ions that were out here in the plasma traveling through the blood, they come back into the red blood cell. Chlorine moves out, again our chloride shift, so that we keep our charge balanced. This bicarbonate ion combines with protons, becomes carbonic acid. The carbonic anhydrase enzyme very rapidly converts it into water and CO2. That CO2 then leaves the red blood cell, diffuses across the plasma and into the alveolus. So we're getting oxygen being picked up from the alveolus and carbon dioxide being released into the alveolus so we can exhale it and get rid of it. If we look at a nice little summary, kind of putting this whole thing together with external respiration and internal respiration and our two transport processes. Let's follow oxygen first. So we have high partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs, low partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. So oxygen moves out of the alveolus and into the blood, where it is pumped back to the heart. The heart pumps it out to all the bodies. Oxygen is mostly dissolved, mostly being carried by hemoglobin at all of our tissues. Oxygen disassociates from hemoglobin and moves into our tissues. If we then follow our carbon dioxide that was made at all of our body tissues, that carbon dioxide, most of it dissolved as bicarbonate ions, travels through the body to the right side of the heart. Heart pumps it to the lungs, where it then diffuses out of the blood and into the lungs, and then out the respiratory system and out the nose in order to be exhaled and gotten rid of. So that's exchange and transport in summary.